Hey everyone, and welcome back to the Waxcast, episode 24. Crazy 48 hours we've all experienced, and we just got to keep putting out episodes to get our whole situation figured out. I'm not sure exactly what's been going on, but to help me figure that out, I'm joined today by right-wing commentator Eduardo Neret, or if you can't pronounce French, Eduardo Neret. His choice, your choice. Call him whatever you want. Doesn't really matter. But anyway, Eduardo, thank you for joining us.
Thanks for having me. You respect the French heritage, so you're one of the few, so I appreciate that. Thanks for having me, Gavin.
Of course, I think it's part of, the right-wing tradition to respect our traditions, to respect our heritage, and, not just, cave to whatever, the mob says. But let's talk, Eduardo, because I like your writings. I like your commentary online. I think we see eye to eye on a lot of things. What do you make of the speech we heard today? It seems Trump, after a pretty, after a long 24 hours, seems to have reversed course. He was on the Mall. He was in D.C. telling his supporters he'll never concede, that we have to march to the Capitol. We have to, hold the line against the fraud, which I do believe existed. And now, a negative press storm later, something which he's not, unaccustomed to, it seems that he's reversed course and he is going to begin the transition of power. I mean, what do you make of all this?
Yeah, look, I don't think the statement itself means much, given that, the media is going to say he should have done it sooner. They're going to say he should have said those things sooner. And as far as addressing his supporters, I actually do wish he would have said some of those things sooner. Like, we can get into the fraud. I believe a lot of the fraud in this election occurred with some of the states changing their election laws to accommodate mail-in ballots, and that is all true. But I think where Trump really went wrong, and, I hate to sort of lead with this, but something that I really felt bad for a lot of the supporters yesterday, seeing some of them being interviewed by Fox News and whatnot, is, leading them on with this idea that Mike Pence was going to be able to overturn the inevitable, that Joe Biden was going to be president. And I believe Trump knew that that was not true. Part of me thinks, if Trump really thought the election was stolen, would you come out with a statement and say, oh, well, it's stolen, but, we're moving on now? I mean, so that's to me where I say, how much of was he saying it just for the supporters versus what he actually believed? And so I think that's where he does some damage. I think, he did damage and he did a disservice, ironically, to the people who care about him most and who support him most, by saying Pence was going to do this, Pence was going to be able to overturn it all. And of course, all these people went to Capitol Hill expecting that to happen. It didn't happen. So as far as the statement goes, it was a good statement. I mean, I think he's right about the fact that the nation needs to heal and come together. Don't think we're going to be getting so much from that. I think both political sides are responsible for a lot of the divisions we're seeing right now. They have fomented and manipulated and taken advantage of the hatred that was on display yesterday. Not maybe specifically, but some of that anger and hatred that we saw on display for many years now, predating Trump, both sides have taken advantage of and used. So the statement in a nutshell, a good one. Perhaps people will say he should have done it sooner. I don't think it means much. I think he's going to continue to be criticized from the left and the right. So
agreed. He was in a lose-lose situation. I mean, yeah. Partly of his own making. I mean, I think, we're talking about the mixed messages coming out of his administration. I mean, would you attribute some of that just to the people he surrounded himself with? He did have one, coterie of people, maybe in the Giuliani camp, who were definitely kind of all in on this strategy. Apparently ended up being a failed strategy to contest these results at the state level, then eventually at the congressional level. And then you may have had, people in his family, say Kushner or Ivanka, or, the other more establishment liberal members of his administration. I mean, do you think these two factions pulling him in either direction, like the devil and the angel on someone's shoulder from the old cartoons, do you think that played a role in kind of this mixed up, jumbled messaging coming out of Trump in the White House?
I think they definitely have played a role. And in a way, you could argue that's probably one of the biggest errors of his presidency. I mean, where you see a lot of good actions and positive actions, or maybe actions that aren't as wrong as the media has made them out to be, but a failure to communicate that. And then, of course, that gets lost. As far as Giuliani goes, I had no problem with Giuliani wanting to contest the results of the election. I think, unfortunately, and maybe unfairly so, he has become a caricature. They have made him into a character. And seeing what he and Jenna Ellis did yesterday, I thought was pretty low. I mean, I thought what Jenna Ellis's tweet yesterday saying, "Oh, well, Mike Pence let us all down. It's too bad he didn't take the path we offered forward." I mean, come on, like I just don't understand how far it's like people like Jenna Ellis and Giuliani are digging the grave of the Trump movement. Like if you really, and this is part of my problem. This is why I've been so upset about this over the last few days. And in many ways, I feel like you can relate. There are very few people who can relate. I mean, Pedro Gonzalez, as you know him. He's been one of the people talking about this over the last few days, and Coulter. And the whole point of their message, I think, has been, and I agree completely, is if you really care about the nationalist populist movement, if you're Trump and you care about the movement that you started, or if you're one of his allies and you care about that movement, many of them, which they don't, by the way. I mean, many of the people who served in the administrations really only cared about themselves. They joined the administration to try to mold and put the administration in a direction that they saw fit or that was beneficial to them. But broadly speaking, if you're anyone and you care about the nationalist populist America First movement, yesterday a lot of damage was done to it, and I think a lot of people who think they care about the movement were part of that damage. I think people who wish yesterday hadn't happened are going to pay the price for that damage. I mean, people like you and me, people who care about the movement, we're going to pay the price for this. And so I'm kind of frustrated seeing people like Jenna Ellis continue to say the things that she has said, because she's digging a grave that some of us are going to have to try to climb out of. She's digging a grave that the broader movement is going to try to how to get out of. So, I mean, again, I say to these people, if you care, like, just stop. I don't know.
Well, let's zoom in on Pence. Let's zoom in on Pence, because I understand your argument, and I think some things that they were saying about Pence definitely crossed the line. My only thing with Pence is that he did have his staff and his sort of office was a kind of a focal point of a lot of the people you referenced earlier,
yes,
who were trying to sabotage the administration and shift it in different directions. A lot of these, Koch funded type of analysts, a lot of these Beltway, sort of think tank people, a lot of these really con Inc. Establishment types really were part of his team. And, I never really had an issue with the guy. I mean, I don't think he has a future politically or even presidentially. I think he's too bland and boring. But, maybe some of the criticism that he's been getting was correct. Obviously, there was a bit of a scapegoating thing going on in terms of, did he even have this ability to do it? Legalistic question, whatever it is. Most people seem to say he did not have this ability, and I don't think he was going to be the guy to test it out. And I think if your whole strategy rested on, a guy like Pence, a pretty milquetoast guy like Pence, being the person to test the constitutionality of a crazy Hail Mary scheme, I mean, I think your plan was kind of BS to begin with. All that said, there are fundamental issues with people in Pence's, realm, part of this overall White House infiltration by people who are trying to subvert the MAGA agenda, Trump's message, et cetera, et cetera. I mean, what do you make of that?
Yeah, and absolutely. I mean, you look at Mark Short, who is currently Pence's chief of staff. I mean, he
and banned from the White House apparently right now.
Right. Well, yeah. I was going to say that's hilarious, but the flip side to that is, well, it only took 4 years. I mean, Mark Short was a guy undermining the Trump legislative agenda on day one. He was initially a liaison to Congress in charge of the entire administration's legislative agenda, and he was undermining it.
The first 2 years we had united government. We had no legislative agenda. I mean, beyond tax cuts.
Right. And in parts, thanks to people like Mark Short. So I think it's funny that he's now banned, but it's like, okay, in the last 2 weeks when, again, I mean, for Trump or whoever directed Mark Short to be banned, it's not like they just got upset with Mark Short yesterday, right? I mean, this was probably brewing for a while. So if they had a problem with Mark Short, why didn't they fire him weeks, months, years ago? I mean, and that's those are sort of the very questions that Trump supporters have to face and reckon with, which are not easy questions. I mean, a lot of the people who marched yesterday, a lot of the people who will be listening to this, a lot of the people who share our views online, at least for me personally, the last 24 to 36 hours, it's difficult to face the facts of the damage that these last few hours have done to the movement. And it's an uncomfortable situation. Even Tucker Carlson alluded to it tonight. Is Trump the man worth all of this? I mean, supporting the ideas, but Trump at the end of the day really only thinks about himself. And that's what Tucker Carlson alluded to. That's what Ann Coulter wrote about in a column just a few days ago. That's what Pedro has been saying on Twitter. That's what others have been saying. And so, again, I mean, I think it's a difficult thing that the supporters have to face and have to
push back on that. Because I did see an online Twitter spat between Scott Greer and Pedro, basically saying, well, Scott saying basically, well, people like Pedro say this, and they're always down on Trump, but he's all we have, and they never offer an alternative. I would pose the same question to you, being in this sort of broader camp. I mean, what is the alternative? He has his flaws. He's not perfect. No one is. But he's also brought tons to the table that never would have existed outside of who he is and his persona. He's galvanized people. People have been attracted to him. I mean, you could run a person who's much more philosophically and ideologically in line. Maybe they're a better governor and better administrator, but there is something about him as an individual that has brought this movement sort of together and kind of tied a lot of pieces, for better or for worse. I mean, how do you counter that? And who's the alternative now that he's gone?
That is 100% true. I don't think this movement kicks off without a guy like Trump at the helm. The good things that we can look back on today are because of him and only him. And that is a good point. The question is who else? And for the record, like, I'm not one of those. I think there's several types of Republicans over these last 4 years. There have been the people who have sided with Trump no matter what, even maybe to the detriment of what America First means, right? These are people who claim to love Trump, but they'll defend the First Step Act. They'll defend, jailbreak and things like that.
And right? I don't think they're doing that because they're ideologically committed to those things. I think they're just low information voters who are dedicated to their idea of who Trump is. And if it was Trump and he was directing things in the right direction, it would be perfect, because you wouldn't have to explain all the complexities of whatever policy he's proposing. They will blindly follow it. I think there is a value in having blind, loyal followers if they're directed correctly.
And so you have those people. You have people who never liked Trump from day one. All the crap about, the institutions or violating our norms. Those people, those Republicans. Yeah. You have people who never really liked him, but pretended to warm to him to advance their own policy goals, like the Lindsey Grahams of the world, which, fine, maybe you can argue, you understand why they do the things they do, but never really allies anyway. And then I feel like there's another camp, of which I would probably consider you. And that's the camp I'm in. And by the way, I say this to sort of say, I'm not someone who's takes joy or wants to kind of criticize Trump or whatever. But I consider myself, over the last 4 years, one of his strongest supporters. I mean, I defended all of the ideas and values he ran on in 2016. I praised him and defended him when he did them. I criticized maybe when he moved away from him, but I was never one of those people. And I don't, think many of us were. I never cared, when he beat up on a reporter or if he attacked the media, all of that crap about, again, violating our norms, or he's dangerous for a democracy. Like, I never bought into that. I won't buy into that now. But I don't think there's anything necessarily wrong with saying, look, this is a movement. The facts of the matter is, maybe unfairly to him, and that's a whole other discussion about fraud in the election. But the fact is, Biden, and I said this 2 or 3 days after the election, I said that there's fraud. I did a podcast on it, but I said, we know how these things work, right? Like, Hillary never paid the price for Benghazi. We never got answers on Russia collusion.
Crimes go unpunished all the time in the
right.
swamp.
So I made the prediction then, and I hate to be correct on it, but that when all the dust settles, Biden was going to be inaugurated January 20th. That still is true. So if I'm Trump, and I wish he would do this, and there's definitely still time, although he hurt himself yesterday a little bit. But if I'm Trump, I step back and I say, let me be honest about it. Let me tell my supporters, the people I care about, that, which he did tonight. I'm not going to be president. Biden's going to be president. And he is still the most powerful Republican we have in this country. Right. And so he can do two things. He can choose to run in 2024, or actually he can do three things. He can choose to go into the sunset and never appear again, which I think many people in the media will try to make happen through, investigations, whatever. Or he can, and maybe this kind of ties into running in 2024, he can form a PAC. He can use his influence to primary those who went against him and his agenda. He can use his influence to, again, make sure his movement, the movement he started, has a role in the Republican future. And I think what people are going to have to decide is, and by the way, the administration
that effort has been hurt by this, because he's kind of walking away like a broken puppy, so to speak. And he's not the guy he was 48 hours ago, which was definitely going to go and burn down the GOP, I would have assumed, because he is a guy who holds a grudge. He is a guy who doesn't forget, which are all good qualities. If you're trying to wage an intra-party war, those are the exact qualities you want in a person. But unfortunately, now it seems his position, his political capital has waned a bit, and the people that are the worst influence on him internally within his own camp are going to be using what happened to justify more horrible advice they give to him post-presidency.
Right. There were a lot of, I think, again, those establishment Republicans who tolerated him, who wouldn't have opposed him getting involved politically post 2020. After yesterday's events, like you just mentioned, he's made it a lot harder because a lot of these people are going to use yesterday's events, even though they never liked him to begin with, and they were happy to dump him whenever. They just used yesterday to jump ship when many of them have been wanting to jump ship for months.
They all had their bottled up vitriol against him, and this was just the perfect excuse. He was down. They beat him while he was down. They took advantage of the situation well politically. If I was in their shoes and I had as much contempt for him as they do, they maximized this to the fullest extent. I think, he probably could have done things between, the end of the rally and when the Capitol storming was going on, to have made the situation better. But I also think, before we jump the ship, we were kind of alluding to this earlier, that he's been starting to make a lot of decisions towards the end of his administration that we had wished he did the last 4 years. We mentioned Short earlier being, barred from the White House. I think Ryan Gerdusky came out with a tweet saying, some of his most recent executive orders were actually very, very good, fantastic, and they should have, came out, months, years ago. But he could still, he could still do that for the next, 12, 13 days. Executive orders, he could still do pardons, he could still do mass declassifications. He could cement some solid legacy in those last actions of his administration. I would hope he still goes ahead with it. And I hope he doesn't think, okay, now I have to be, Mr. Nice Guy and step it back a bit because I'm worried about my legacy. His legacy will be cemented what he does the next 13 days, I believe.
Yeah. And even if he does those things, by the way, again, many people have said this, whether you think it's fair or unfair, the last, 24 to 48 hours, the media love that this happened. They were waiting 4 years for an event like this to happen. And so they're going to, whether you like it or not, whether people listening to this like it or not, use that to define part of his legacy. So like you said, he's got 13 days left. It's imperative that he does whatever he can, if he has an interest in a political future, to do that. And what you said about Ryan, he came onto my podcast and said the same thing. It's such a shame because the last 2 years, 1.5 years, were really getting good on the policy.
That's why the second term was fantastic, because he didn't have, the outward pressures of, the investigation, Russiagate, that stuff. And he was getting better staffing. He was getting more experience with the system governance. The second term would have been, incredible, honestly. I'm not saying it would have been perfect, but compared to the first term and based on what we're discussing and what we would have liked to have seen, I think it only would have got better and better.
And so if he wants to do that, I think when Trump supporters look at him going forward, they have to decide, do they want, like you talked about before, people who give bad, do we want Javanka at the helm, Jared and Ivanka, those policy advisors at the helm of his policy, or do we want, the Trump that we voted for in 2016? And that's going to help define what type of support he has going forward. I still think most of the 75 million people who voted for him will support him, but I think part of his success is determined on on which advice he listens to.
Well, let's touch on that, what you just said, the 75 million, because I do think there is a active deception going on in the media that they're trying to paint what happened yesterday as this, completely horrendous event that can never be excused. It's going to be a stain on his legacy forever. But honestly, I think outside of certain circles, right, left, center, whatever, I think the bulk of his supporters are still with him.
Yes.
This is not his first, it's not his first media storm. This is not his first controversy. They accused him of being an agent of Russia, for Christ's sake. The things that he's been labeled up until today could in many ways be argued to be far worse than what we saw, especially because he still has, a great defense to say, listen, I told them to march in that direction. We've had rallies before. I never advocated them to storm it, and I condemned it within an hour. So he still has a ton of stuff that honestly he probably should have said more explicitly in his concession speech. But I really don't see his base disappearing, dissipating, leaving him. I think his political capital is actually still way better. It's obviously been dented, but, we're talking about, degrees here. It's still pretty strong. So these establishment Republicans that you were discussing, saying how, they were willing to work with him before, but now they wouldn't even want to touch him. They'd be very stupid to make those political calculations. I called out Nancy Mace today because she was like one of the first to stick a knife in his back. She ran as a populist Republican, got elected on his coattails, and now she's going on CNN and just bashing him left and right. I don't think that's a good move politically. I think it's insane political move. And it's also just from an ideological perspective, you're just like a shameless hack. But if we're just going to talk on the political angle, they'd all be crazy to think that they could, if he really wanted to wage an open war with them, that he would lose, because some of his biggest political miscalculations over the last 4 years were at the behest of people like Mitch McConnell and the establishment wing directing him against his gut instincts, which have generally been very good. I mean, I don't think he liked Loeffler. I mean, he did it because he had to. I mean, he did a lot of these things, almost out of like begrudgingly. So, I mean, what do you think of that?
No, and that is true. I think most of his supporters will still be with him no matter what, which is why you're seeing the media come out with such a ferocious animus, trying to set the terms of what happened yesterday. When we look back at what happened, there's going to be what happened, and there's going to be what the media talked about and hyped up as terms of happening. And by the way, that's not to say anything that happened yesterday with regards to the violence and the riots were okay. I mean, this goes without saying, and I'm not going to spend a lot of time on it because, if you assume someone's a decent person, you don't have to go around saying this, but I know you and I, we never defend riots. We don't defend riots anywhere, whether it's Black Lives Matter, whether it's here. We don't defend violence, and it was wrong. But I think what's more concerning, what's almost as equally concerning, actually what is equally concerning, and that the media won't spend any time focusing on because they don't care and because they don't care about the country, is
why
trying to look at why we got to this place. Why? I mean, it's whether it's Black Lives Matter, Antifa, or the Trump supporters yesterday. It's very concerning that people in this country think they have to resort to that because of a grievance. And so when that happens, it speaks to a direct failure of our government and our politics, by the way, on both sides. So, listening to Congress yesterday, listening to these members of Congress with their little speeches, and I saw Republican conservative commentators, so-called conservative commentators online saying, "Oh, Mitch McConnell's speech is wonderful." Like, if
the Guy Bensons of the world, every time the guy opens his mouth, Mitch McConnell being, I mean, it's just like, oh my God, he just delivered the greatest, Shakespearean act ever. I mean, it's like these like adoring praises. It's like it's so insufferable.
And my problem is, if you're going to the people who, as I said in the beginning, who have for years manipulated our divisions to sow hatred for their own political gain, who have all been part of the problem, left and right, if you're going to these very people now, after something like that happens, you don't understand the problem. So, if your answer is to Congress, who has played a role in this, to be part of the solution and to be part of the unifying factor, I think that's what the issue is. And the media as well. I mean, look, some of what I watched this unfold live yesterday. I was flipping between CNN, MSNBC, and Fox, and frankly, some of the commentary, if not most of it, was disgusting. I mean, to hype up, if you care about your country and this is unfolding, Fox was the only outlet that, of course, did this, is you report what's going on, you say what's going on. And if it were me, if I'm, hosting a show and I'm in the media, I'm trying to keep the people calm and I'm trying to keep it level-headed. But you turn over
not hysterics and hyperbole and
insurrection, terrorism, domestic terrorism. They're trying to take over Congress to overturn the election. I mean, it's totally irresponsible, aside from being an exaggeration. I mean, look, again, like,
and that's been my argument. Like, look, I said, if you break the law, you break the law. If you committed trespassing, you suffer the punishment for it. But everything has to be put in perspective. I mean, historical perspective, just the perspective of the scales of what we're talking about here. I mean, this, in the grand scheme of things, I really don't think what happened was that big of a deal. I think obviously the people that were engaged in this stuff should face repercussions. I mean, they still broke laws, of course, enforced the laws. But the stuff that has been circulating online, particularly among the right, particularly because I expect what we're getting from the MSNBCs, I expect what we're getting from the left. But these commentators, many of which, I generally tend to agree with, even, I'm not talking about just exclusively the Guy Bensons of the world, even just people who tend to be more on our
Eric Erickson said,
like, shoot them all.
Shoot them all. He said, "I'm team shoot them all." And then he had another tweet. I think he deleted the shout them all tweet because I tried to find it after I couldn't find it.
He was forced to, I think. He did. I think he did get hit with Twitter or something.
Yeah, because I tagged Twitter safety because, fine. Like, look at this actual
insane call to murder.
Insane. And that's what I'm saying. Everybody needs to calm down, take a step back. Like you said, talk about what happened. Again, I'm against people who break the law. I'm against criminals always, so by the way, if you're one of these people out there, whether you're a regular person, politician, member of the media, who is only selectively outraged at certain mobs, or you're only against committing crimes sometimes, or you're only for defending public and private property rights sometimes, just sit down and shut up. Like, sit this one out. None of those people should be allowed to talk right now. But like you said, and like Ann Coulter, has written on Twitter several times over the last few days. Yeah, these people, charge them, arrest them. They should be. But really, to call this, I think she was responding to a Scaramucci tweet who said he said the people who stormed in were going to try to execute members of Congress.
Oh, please.
He said they stormed in and they took selfies. So, I want to
It
say
was a troll. It was a giant like internet troll job almost in parts of it. I mean, I was watching it and I was like, what is going on? We're like an upside down world right now. I'm seeing like literally like living memes right before my eyes. And the problem is that they look at these people with such disdain and disgust, and they can't understand. They blame everything on Trump. They say, "Oh, Trump rallied the bases." The last year, we have driven millions of Americans into destitution, forced government destitution. We prevented them from working, we prevented them from opening their businesses, and we've kept them in their homes. We have created this mass sociological experiment that is really bringing our country to the brink. And all they can do, as Anderson Cooper did on CNN, is make fun of them because they may eat really bad Italian food in Olive Garden. And I will say it's very bad. But at the same time, it's like, this contempt and this arrogance and this smugness from the right and from the left, all the Beltway, is making people pissed off. They're not stupid. They see this. They're angry. They're sick of what's happening. Trump is one part of it in terms of, what happened to him. And they definitely had a legitimate grievance there. But you don't get thousands of people to storm the nation's capital who obviously knew there's a good chance of them getting arrested or worse. They don't engage in acts like that, extreme acts like that, unless they just feel like they have no other option and they're just so disgusted with what's going on. And to reach that point, that's a testament to how wrong our society is being run.
And again, if you're someone, which many of the members of the media claim they are these very people, but they're not. But if you're someone who looks at the situation yesterday and say, wow, this is concerning for my country. I don't want it to happen again. I don't want people to feel that they need to resort to this. I don't want to see this. Then it's your duty. Again, politicians, members of the media, regular citizens, if you feel that way, then it's everyone's duty to take a step back and look at how we got here. And by the way, like you said, there are a lot of Republicans who are loving the opportunity to blame this on Trump. Of course, we expect the media and the Democrats to use this crisis to blame it on Trump. They didn't even wait to do that. Chuck Schumer talking about the worst day since Pearl Harbor. It's so absurd. But for Republicans to do this, it's like, if you are looking at this through a lens of Trump, not only are you wrong, but it's totally short-sighted. Yep. A lot of this anger predates the entire Trump presidency. There's a large segment of this country that feels like they have been ignored by the politicians. And so here, Trump comes around as a politician and maybe
he channels that frustration as a good politician.
And for his flaws or for the arguments about, well, is he that policy? At the end of the day, those voters, these ignored people for several decades in this country, people who hadn't voted in generations, people who had, switched parties to vote for him, they felt like at the end of the day that Trump was saying to them, I am listening to you. And so couple that with everything that you mentioned that's gone on this year, telling people their kids can't go to school, they can't go to work, they're losing their job. The government basically doesn't exist anymore because they're not going to protect your community when there's a riot in your community. Right. But by the way, if you dare try to go to work, we're going to ruin your life. All of these things combined, coupled with an election that had over 100 million people vote by mail. And, don't you dare ask any questions about it because you're some kook or conspiracy theorist. Right. I mean, people are angry. And again,
and they don't care, and they don't seem to realize where this is heading. It's the arrogance, because they were talking about the 25th Amendment. They were talking about doubling down. I mean, they couldn't even take a win, because they did win. I will give it to them. They won in this sort of political media fight battle that we just witnessed. But they couldn't accept that and reorganize and move on. They were trying to double down and go even further. And, this 25th Amendment stuff, this impeachment, I mean, they're out of their minds. I mean, if they went ahead with something like that, and maybe they still will over the next 12 days, or 12, 13 days, I don't know if they've lost the momentum there. But if they actually did that, that just proves to what you said earlier. They don't care about unity. They're actually just poking. They're poking this bear. They're poking this giant, wildebeest that's been sleeping, that's ready just to burst. And, who knows what happens after that? That's a dark place for our country.
Well, a lot of the people, talking about the 25th Amendment, I think you're seeing a lot of that conversation because, you mentioned earlier, a lot of these pardons, will Julian Assange be pardoned? Will Snowden be pardoned? I think they're fearful of those things. And, I hate to say this, but it's true, is that, it's so disappointing that these members of Congress care more, they really only care about riots when they're threatened, when they feel
Right.
unprotected, when they feel uncomfortable, when it's on their doorstep. Like, it's too bad our actual leaders can't care about riots all the time. They can't care about keeping all of us safe. And so I think part of the element of the unified response we saw yesterday, and by the way, anytime right and left are unified on something in Washington should be a little bit of a concern, like if it's war, the spending, whatever. And so I think part of the response we saw yesterday is like, how dare these people? And like you said, not a second of, obviously wanting to apprehend those who are responsible, but not a second of, there's a lot of hatred on this country. Both parties need to step back. And I was telling a lot of my personal friends today, if I really believed Democrats, whether at an individual level or at an elected official level, were willing to sit down and say, hey, we've all been responsible for some of the heated, talk and rhetoric in this country, and without playing the blame game, let's just sit down and agree to kind of tone down the heat here. I'd be willing to do that. I'd be willing to sit down with a Democrat and have that conversation, but I don't think they're interested in doing that.
It's not genuine. It's not genuine. It's all just platitudes.
They're interested in and really quickly, and I'll give you back the floor, but they're interested in punishing people for not only for yesterday, but for the last 4 years. And let me tell you why. So I never watched late night. It's not funny. I was about to say late night comedy, but it's not really comedy. And I stumbled upon last night, and Colbert is on, and he was like extreme. He had on Amy Klobuchar, he had Adam Kinzinger. And immediately, these people are talking about, this is Josh Hawley's fault. This is Ted Cruz's fault. They have blood on their hands. They're sinners. Like, Colbert actually called Ted Cruz a sinner for his actions, and they needed to be punished. And again, like, as far as the objecting to the election, which, by the way, the Democrats have done that for 3 of the past elections that they've lost at the presidential level. They have objected in the Senate. At the very least, I think the objections, if you're a Republican or Democrat out there who doesn't think, the fraud thing is worth talking about. But again, I think at the very, very least, objecting to the certification of the results at least tells those supporters out there who are angry, they feel like they have their day. They feel like they have their day on the floor where someone can talk about it. They feel like they're being heard. But for them to clamp down before and after yesterday's events and say, no, you better not object to the certification. Objecting is endorsing this violence and this bloodshed. I mean, that's insane. That's basically, don't question anything. Don't question anything we say. And if you do, you're responsible for bloodshed or something. It's ridiculous.
It is. It's insane, and it just shows, the American body politic is just completely screwed up at the moment, and we have these, these real demagogues, everything they label Trump with and they accuse Trump of, they themselves are guilty of. It's really self-projection en masse, with people like Kinzinger, whatever the hell you say his name, and and Colbert and all these other hacks. I mean, it's never ending. It's never ceasing. They're always out for blood. Who was it? Oberman the other week, whatever. He was literally calling for blood. I mean, they're all unhinged. They've adopted their woke, their new left-wing ideology, however you want to describe it, as their religion, and that's how they're acting. They are acting like a cult. Everything they accuse the Trump side of, is just as true for them, if not only true for them. But I want to talk more about the future now. Oh, yes.
Yeah, sorry. Really quick before you go on, I just want to say one more thing about Congress. And most of the people listening probably know this. But again, I've seen a lot of so-called commentators on the right on Twitter say, oh, you can't do whataboutism with this. I don't want to hear about BLM or whatever. It's just not the same thing. But there are a couple things, too, that I think have happened over the last 4 years that are important to mention. I really take offense being lectured to by these members of Congress about the sanctity of our institutions, about attacking democracy, when they themselves have been the very people who have defiled and corrupted our institutions. These are many of the very same people who have, endorsed the Mueller investigation, endorsed a Russia collusion hoax to unseat a president. And so now they want to lecture us about respecting institutions just because their side won. I mean, and I think Mark Stein, I don't know if you caught Tucker last night, but he said it, and I have his comments here, is he basically said, they're acting so insulted about the institution of Congress when Nancy Pelosi said she doesn't care about statues. Mitch McConnell has said he doesn't care about changing the name of Confederate bases. But now all of a sudden, we're supposed to believe they care about our institutions. Why isn't Pelosi saying, oh, it's just a building? So many, again, left and right, they have been responsible for degrading our institutions, degrading our heritage, our history. And so really, to be at the end of the day, at the end of yesterday, I wasn't really interested in being lectured by these people. And
I think most people feel exactly the same way you do. I think they see through this. They see through these two-faced lies and this hypocrisy and all these double standards, and they're sick of it. And then you want to talk about ruining faith in the institutions? That's what does it. These absolute,
Yeah.
just falsehoods that they preach as gospel regularly. I mean, that is destroying faith in the institutions. Trump supporters are not. I mean, we are at a low point if we care about. And I mean, the institutions obviously should be, robust, and they should be working for our national interest and for the people. They're obviously not. That's why I could give a damn about respect for them. But if we do return to a place where the institutions are working for us, you want to protect them, you want to instill these values, but it's going to be very hard to return to that based on what they've done to really, destroy all of their credibility. But I think we've hammered a lot of what's happened, what's going on. I want to talk about the future, because you've been giving some great analysis, much of which I agree with. I mean, where do you see it going from here? I mean, prior to this, there was a decent contingent of people who said, all right, Trump lost, it was probably fraud. We don't know to what degree, but I still think he has a large base. Without COVID, without all these issues and 4 years of horrible Democratic rule, he'll have a chance in 2024. He's the best shot we have. We should rally behind him. Now it seems, obviously, after yesterday, that has been dampened both by a dent in his political capital and maybe his own aspirations have waned to want to do it himself. But whatever happens in 4 years, I truly believe 4 years of Democrat rule is going to put a bad taste in many people's mouth. I don't know how long Biden is going to last for that time, but I do think 2024 and even 2022, if we're smart, Republicans or whatever is left of Republicans should be able to make a decent counteroffensive in reclaiming seats, in regaining political capital, in maybe taking the presidency in 4 years. But the question is, who is going to be that person? And, had you asked me a week ago, regardless of what I thought was going to happen with the election, I would have told you I don't believe it could possibly be someone from the old establishment, neoconservative, moderate wing, because they've just lost so much credibility. But the problem is that they are going to manipulate the data, they're going to manipulate the narrative, and they're going to claim that the losses that happened, which were not due to Trump, which were largely due, in my mind at least, were largely due to BS. I mean, honestly, I do think most of it did come down to fraud. And yes, there was a dampening. Yes, the Dems had better turnout. But the answer is not to return to Romney. I think Romney would have done even worse. I would have said a moderate Republican would have done even worse than Trump. But now they're going to use whatever data they can and however they can skew it to suggest, no, if we want to win, if we want to have any chance of governing, we need to pick a Nikki Haley. We're going to need to pick, anyone, to the left of Mitt Romney, essentially. And it's going to be harder to counter them because the fact remains is that Trump did lose on paper, and we did lose the Senate. And and then they're gonna compare the fact that we did well down ballot. That just shows people like Republicans. They didn't like Trump. I think that's BS. But how do we counter that? And who is our champion going to go forward if we have one?
Well, you make a lot of good points. I think the counter to an establishment Republican who'd want to make the argument that Trump on the ticket is a loser. I mean, he got the most votes of any incumbent in history, right? Like, it wasn't enough to win this time. I certainly think if you don't have vote by mail, he wins. He overperformed in a lot of ways than last time. So I think it's hard to make an argument. Of course, before these last few days of he is not a viable person moving forward. I absolutely think he was. And like you said, we can talk about how much damage he's done to himself.
I could see that he lost, maybe older whites and lost ground with maybe college educated whites, which was fine. But you cannot disregard, the gains he made within, working class, Hispanic communities. He seemed to have held his base with the working class whites. It just seemed that this was an election that just defied all previous standards, precedent, et cetera, because he did everything on paper that he was supposed to do as an incumbent, and he should have won by massive numbers. But it just seems that every point quantitatively that he hit, Biden always just was able to just outdo it somehow in some fashion. If he did it, he did it. If he didn't, he still got it. But,
And I think if you don't have COVID, Trump certainly wins as well. I would say in terms of things I wish he would have done that the next Republican is going to have to do is really go after some of those white working class voters in the Rust Belt that, ironically enough, were maybe ignored and favored of some of this diverse coalition that Trump tried to put together, which worked out in some ways, but I think not to what he would have hoped, obviously.
And I think a lot of people have been very critical of that. And I think,
I've been too, to be honest.
And I have too, but I'm just going to be my own devil's advocate here. I think if you're looking back at 2018, 2017, the dynamics were different, and they were thinking the economy keeps propelling, we're doing things well, we're going to hold our white working class base. but how can we really screw the Dems over more? They're a party based on holding this crazy coalition at really high supermajorities of different demographic groups. They're thinking, okay, if we chip away a few points from that coalition, their whole house of cards mathematically collapses, because it only takes a few points on the margins to flip. They're not saying you're going to win the black vote. They're not saying you're going to have to win the Hispanic vote. But if you chip a few points away from them in key states, you could cause a sort of electoral landslide. So I think that was what they were thinking. And it made sense at the time. The problem is that when COVID hit and when all these new dynamics hit that really, decimated the economy and decimated his reelection chances, they didn't pivot to target the base like the Dems always did. They still maintained that strategy of which is a fine strategy to have if you're riding high on a great economy and everything else is holding strong. But if you're in an economic collapse and you're losing your support, you're losing your base, you got to go back to the base, which they never did that pivot until it was too late.
Yeah, and as far as Georgia goes, that should not have happened. We could talk about blame, who deserves blame there, I'm sure, for a long time. But let's talk about, like you said, moving forward. And I actually want to start with the Democrats. I think most of who determines how successful the GOP, I think the cards are in their hands. Obviously, the Democrats are going to do what the Democrats do. I actually think Manchin, hopefully, Senator Joe Manchin from West Virginia will prevent a lot of the craziness we're seeing from Biden.
And Sinema?
That is hopeful. Yeah, Sinema will as well. But look, we're already seeing what many of us predicted. The big tech companies using yesterday's events as an excuse to clamp down on conservatives. Trump is going to be totally purged from those platforms, even if he runs again. You watch. Dan Bongino was banned permanently from Twitter for simply. Actually, I don't think it was permanent, but
12 hours. He's going to quit though.
Right. For sharing the video from yesterday. So people have been warning about this for a while. Like, if we don't address some of these things, it's going to be harder and harder for conservatives and Republicans to win. That is one thing. If Biden wants to go the crazy left route, I think he's really gifting the next few elections to the Republicans. I think that will backfire. Though, if he gets something like amnesty, it doesn't matter. I hate to say it, but Republicans will never win another election again if amnesty happens.
True.
And but
he has been picking more moderate picks, though, which has been interesting. In many ways, it's to the right of Obama's cabinet. He is picking a lot of these backbencher, moderate white Dems. And I had a post about it where I basically said his team is doing this kind of game of chicken where they'll come out and they'll be like, oh, we may consider a blue dog or a Republican. The left will freak out, and then they'll be like, oh, no, it's a moderate Dem, and they'll just throw him that bone. And they keep getting away with it. And in my perspective, I'm like, all right, well, at least it's not going to be, Eric Holder or some other, and that stuff matters, with the brass tacks of things. But what does this mean for us? If he's going to have a moderate cabinet, maybe he could, and maybe this new coalition that he may be building may be able to hold over for a few cycles.
Yeah, that's a good point. I think you're going to see him be pretty extreme with executive orders, especially on immigration. He's going to undo a lot of what Trump did, and that's going to cause a lot of chaos. On paper, like you said, this is a corporate cabinet. This is corporate America, running the White House essentially with some of his picks, ironically. I think some of the far left is probably surprised at this. And so that's kind of why I say Biden isn't going to be a consequential president. It should be fairly easy for Republicans to take back the White House, but the ball is in their court. And so what I mean by that is, talking about 25th Amendment, talking about impeachment. If Republicans play a role in that, and we see that over the next 13 days, their shots at 2024 are over. They will piss off the base so much so to the point that I think you'll see millions of people refuse to vote Republican. And actually, by the way, personally, I know a lot of people since the last cycle, since November, who have unregistered as Republicans in light of feeling let down and not, they didn't feel like the RNC and the Republican establishment fought for them. So you want to impeach Trump, you want to do 25, you're shooting your own future in the foot.
That's the thing. I don't think they care. I don't think they care about the inter-party dynamics. I think there is this really crooked establishment that kind of dominates many of the institutions within the GOP that just purely care about their own control intra-party, that they just want to control their own faction, their own caucus. They're happy with being a token minority. It doesn't change their grift. It doesn't change the money coming in. If anything, it does better for them, and they don't have the stress, and they don't have the obligation or responsibility to actually govern and produce results. So I do think there is a really cynical, grifting, corrupt
Yes,
cabal that
and
runs
that's
the
what we
party and doesn't care about these consequential decisions, which on paper you would think would incentivize them to act a certain way, but they don't really seem to care about governing power like the Democrats care about. They just care about their own internal power. The Democrats seem to have this more outward focus where they do care, above all else about power to a creepy extent. That's why they do care about the inter-party dynamics. And that's why they always seem to run circles around us.
That's another very true point, and I think you saw that grift in the Obama years with the Tea Party. The
Yep.
Republicans controlled Congress, I think, for the last 6 years of Obama's presidency, both chambers, and really did nothing. And then, of course, you saw this oh shit moment when Trump wins, and both chambers are controlled by Republicans, and it's like they didn't have the party in line, they didn't have the votes to pass some of their own things. They really didn't know what they were doing.
They didn't do anything. They couldn't even get an Obamacare repeal. That's all they talked about.
They did tax cuts, though. They did tax. They
did tax cuts, and my old libertarian days still kind of come out every now and then. I'm like, the tax cuts weren't even as high as they could have been. I mean, I'm all for shifting the revenue to import tariffs and things like that away from taxes on families and individuals. That's fine. But at the end of the day, their taxes, it was like, okay, great, but that's all you had. You had 2 years. You couldn't pass anything else. I'm not even saying pass a populist agenda. They couldn't even pass their own agenda.
Yeah, and talking about who, if the nominee ends up being this establishment type, I said days after the election, and now especially after Georgia and especially after yesterday, but I said this before that I thought the Republican Party was going to do, the establishment was going to do everything in their power to make sure a guy like Trump could never take the reins of their party again. They were disgusted, they were insulted, they were going to make sure it never happened again, and especially so after yesterday. I do think someone like I do think Nikki Haley will run. I do think other similar types will run. And I used to be, the type of Republican who, at the end of the day, when the primaries were over, I would go and vote Republican down ballot. But I'm not interested in that anymore. I mean, I've told people the Republicans I would vote for at this point. I'm from Florida. I'm doing this from Florida right now. Ron DeSantis would be an excellent candidate. Yes. And this is, again, assuming Trump doesn't run. My second or tied for first pick would be Tom Cotton. Those two to me really embody the future, more populist, more nationalist.
What did you think of his kind of some of the comments lately? I mean, with the objections, etc. He seems to have really kind of gone in a different direction.
I was surprised with the objection, but at its core, I agree with the sentiment. Look, and again, it's a tough decision, and I told some friends, like, look, I agree with some of these things on election fraud, but I'm uncomfortable giving the Senate and the House and the Vice President the power to undo some of these electors. And
that's
again,
fair. They never articulated it that well, and I didn't even necessarily have problems with people like even Mike Lee or Rand Paul, because they're like these libertarians, and they've never presented themselves as anything but that. So I respect their principle. I respect their consistency, even when I disagree with them on votes, when I disagree with them on the stimulus, etc. I get that. But then there's like people like Khan, who's always presented himself in this kind of Trumpian populist fashion, and he never really articulated it in such a way, one. And then two, it's also just, to me, it's like just bad politics. Like, I just felt like if this guy really wants a political future, it's like, you're not going to take this vote. I mean, come on.
Yeah, and he's going to be. And look, someone in the comments, Scott says Cotton, okay, good night. So I'm sure it's over what you're referring to. And Cotton will get hammered for not doing this. I mean, they will. Ted Cruz and Josh Hawley will use this against him. I really like Cotton for his immigration views. One of my problems with Josh Hawley is he embodies the nationalist populist movement, but you never really hear him talk about immigration seriously. And really, most of his gripes with China are about the Uyghurs. And look, frankly, we can all agree that what's going on with the Uyghur Muslims in China is a problem, but there are plenty of other reasons to hate China for what they're doing to actual Americans. And so
those are fair criticisms. Fair criticisms. That's the problem. There's no one perfect. And even DeSantis, I'm hearing, what is it? Cato Gottfried, he's like, oh, he has no charisma. He'll never win outside of Florida.
I mean, you can. That is true. Yeah, I see that. But what I said before, if the nominee, which I don't think it will be, is someone like a Haley, I think Crenshaw's too early in the game to run. But someone,
I think they'll run them like Jeb, and they'll have this arrogance, and they'll have all this money, and they'll have all this backing, and they'll all be like, oh, they're going to be anointed, and they get destroyed again. I think the establishment is really stupid at the end of the day.
And even Marco Rubio, I mean, I think you've seen him make this attempt to move to an economic populist platform, but the problem is like it's not genuine.
Yeah.
Marco Rubio was someone who who ran against amnesty in the Tea Party wave. He said, I will never do amnesty. He gets in and he's part of the Gang of Eight trying to push amnesty. Right. So my thing with Rubio, good. I'm glad you're embracing economic populism, Rubio. The problem is I don't trust you enough to actually put you at the top.
He needed 4 more years of Trump for that pivot to really like fully come about, so that he could have came out of a 2-term Trump presidency and be like, I am, of this wing now. But now that Trump has been cut short, a lot of these people's attempts to pivot have been kind of like stopped. I think
he's going to ditch a lot of that stuff. And then my problem with Cruz, which was my problem with Cruz last time, is ironically enough, I consider myself a deeply ideological person. And I actually heard, Tucker, I hate to keep referencing him, but he's someone who I feel speaks for a lot of us in a very good way. But Tucker was talking about this recently, that one of the appeals to Trump was actually that he was not a deeply ideological person. He was a guy who wanted to get stuff done. So look, I consider myself right-wing. I consider myself ideological. My problem with Cruz is I think in a way he is a conservative Obama. He is someone who would probably not be able to get a lot done because of that ideological purity. And it's like some of these conservatives that you see today, like I can't support this piece of legislation because of this one nitpicky thing or that
don't get involved in politics. They shouldn't get involved in politics. I those kind of people annoy me because it's if you're going to engage in the political process, you have to understand that it's about deal making, it's about pragmatism, and you're going to have to sacrifice things. Otherwise, you're not going to get anything done. It's about winning small battles and moving things on the margins over a long period of time.
And by the way, I love Ted Cruz. I think going at it with Trump in 2016 and the way he was able to put that aside to work alongside him.
He honestly,
nobody in Washington was willing to do that. And he deserves credit for that. There's just something about him that you tell me Ted Cruz president, I don't see it. I don't see it
from like an electoral map standpoint. I just don't see his appeal from like an aesthetics point of view to like to the Midwest, to the Rust Belt, to the blue collar workers. I think he would do better in say in Arizona or maybe Virginia, but that's not going to do anything for him.
He's also really square. I mean, when you hear him talk and he tries to talk to a crowd, it's almost too smart for politics. Like he's a brilliant guy, but and he'll do great with the base. He did great with the base last time. I mean, the core evangelical conservative base.
Yes, but not a working class base. Not a working class, not like traditional Republican base, which is what Trump really built in the party. And if they really capitalized on it, if you had an alliance between, an evangelical Catholic wing, a more secular working class, you would win every election. I mean, that should be the new fusionism, because the fusionism of old didn't do anything for the social conservatives, the evangelicals. They got screwed out of everything, and they're the ones carrying the neocons. They were carrying corporatists for their electoral wins, but they got no windfalls from it. So if you talk to the evangelical base and you talk to the maybe these new emergent Catholic conservative base, and you say, listen, partner with this more secular, economically left working class base that agrees with you on a lot of cultural issues, you'll win every freaking election, hands down.
It's really not rocket science. I mean, and it boils down to, and by the way, really quickly as an aside, a candidate who is gaining a lot of steam on right-wing Twitter, if you will, who people talk about, is Kristi Noem. I have no interest in that, mainly for her immigration views, but that's another day.
Yeah, didn't she let all the Somalians in?
Yeah, she said she was for, refugee programs and stuff like that. I mean, I just want to shoot that down before it gets any steam, at least for my own record.
What about for a VP pick?
For her as a VP pick, I mean, I'd still sort of have a problem with it just because I think they're better people, but I don't know how she would play electorally. I mean, the whole female thing that I guess you sort of have to consider that. But I think what this boils down to, it's like Trump gave the Republican Party a playbook of how to win and how to establish power. So they have to decide now, are they going to... Right. Are they going to use it, or are they going to be so bitter about the fact that maybe he was mean or he did things all that other garbage, as if they don't speak like that.
That's what helped him. You were leading on with this before. His persona, this this just gruff guy from Queens, this kind of like, he has this outer borough blue collar appeal, even though he grew up as a billionaire son or a millionaire son. There's something about him that we've never seen in the Republican Party, because, like you said, you called Cruz a square, and I do a lot of stuff with the Republican Party, young Republicans, all different Republican groups, state, local, national level. There are a lot of squares. There are a lot of people who are just really weird socially, who cannot appeal to an audience, who don't have the charisma, who don't have that factor that just is able to connect and resonate with people. And we found it in Trump, of all places, a guy from New York, from Manhattan, from Queens, that somehow was from everyone, from an evangelical to Texas to a blue collar worker outside of Detroit. And I'm worried we're never going to have that again, because the people that usually rise up the ranks of the party structure do not resemble him in any way, shape, or form. Him emerging from outside the party structure as this independent billionaire businessman who just joined the scene, joined the fray, the party feeder system is never going to produce someone like him to the fullest extent.
No, they won't. And whoever they pick, it's really, really, really easy. Okay. Oppose foreign stupid wars, call for the troops to come back home, support an economy that helps the forgotten working men and women in this country, support America's national sovereignty, tell Americans you are going to put them first and you're not going to waste money with foreign aid, especially in the coronavirus. There are so many Americans who can relate to that, independents and Democrats too, who, you just tell them, look, we've spent billions of dollars in the middle of the coronavirus pandemic to send foreign aid. I'm a candidate. I'm not going to do that. I'm going to spend that money here. All you have to do is say those things. Those are popular ideas. I don't know why the Republican Party is insistent upon ignoring these very
good social media. Good social media, because it used to be, you have a voice for radio, you'll win. If you're good on TV,
they even let us on social media, though. That's the problem. I mean, that's the challenge.
They're killing it. Yeah, right. They are. I mean, if you told me a year or two ago, I would have said, listen, it was radio first, then after radio was TV. That's why Nixon maybe lost the first time outside of the cheating then, and then now it was digital media, and it's like, Trump, his Twitter, this direct stream of consciousness, people loved it. I mean, it pissed off a lot of people, but a ton of other people loved it, and that really pushed him over the edge. And there was one thing I wanted to say about Biden and this whatever would be opposing these candidates we're discussing on the Democrat side. The coalition he cobbled together for 2020 is never going to exist again. It was a coalition that was only anti-Trump. There was a coalition that was based on fears of COVID. When Trump gone and COVID gone, you're never going to get the numbers they got with older whites again. You're not going to get the same number of college-educated whites again. I think there's going to have to be a balancing act. And I think some of the gains that Trump made in certain working-class communities, depending on how the GOP shifts, they can maintain some of it, and you'll have a way stronger base than the GOP was looking at pre-Trump, a way higher starting number in the electoral math. But they could squander it. Who knows? I don't put it past them, but at least he left them with something. He left them with a way better party and a way better setup in government in terms of the legislative chambers, et cetera, than Bush did with the GOP and Obama did with the Dems.
Yeah, and also I think Biden's a dying breed. So if you were a voter in his coalition who bought into the fact that he was a moderate Dem, I mean, how many of them are there left?
They couldn't even replace him, even if they wanted to. There's no one
like. I didn't exactly, unless this person emerges now in the next 4 years who we've never heard of. There was no one else who shared that stage with Biden who would be remotely close to him on policy or persona in terms of being a moderate. So they don't have a chance there.
And that's where they need to radically change demographics over the next 4 years, which I don't think they're going to be able to do really in the next two, because of what you described in the Senate, Manchin, et cetera, which is somewhat, consoling. But, who knows? I mean, the other thing that people talk about, I agree with the demographics component, but something that, Republicans really need to get serious on, it's our own homegrown indoctrination. I mean, people are literally going into schools, coming out of them and hating their parents, hating where they come from, just being self-hating, self-loathsome idiots who are just embracing this wokeism. And yes, we can literally stop immigration tomorrow, but if we don't fix these indoctrination centers that are getting government funding every day, we don't weaponize the Department of Education, if we don't weaponize these institutions against the left, they'll just do it slower, but they'll do it from within. I mean, the immigration is an accelerationist thing, and it's hurting, but we can't ignore what's going on our own campuses and in our own society.
Well, and that's such a tough question. I covered a higher education, liberal bias in it for several years at Campus Reform. And I wish it was simple as saying, an executive order to protect speech on campuses, or, a Department of Education rule to prevent, professors from saying crazy shit. I mean, I wish it was that easy. And actually what I learned in my few years covering that is it is so bad, but it is also beyond that. Like, I think even if you said you were able to fix campuses tomorrow, you were able to prevent some of these extreme radical professors, I think it's worse than that, because I think a lot of kids are going into college and university today already thinking these ways, and they actually influence their peer. There's a whole peer-to-peer element. Right. So I think it's easy to only think about the professor to student influence, which is totally there and exists.
We're too late in many ways. And I honestly think a lot of the things that would really to be done to return society to some semblance of normalcy. The kind of stuff that all these, like, those traditional Catholic conservatives on Twitter talk about, who I agree with on many issues. It's going to require a strong man. It's going to require an authoritarian, because you're not going to be able to achieve any sort of effective policy solutions to this left-wing sort of parasitic infection of our society through legislative means, through committee. It's going to have to come down by diktat, edict, and it's going to have the strong force of law and authority behind it. But that doesn't exist in our system. That doesn't exist within a constitutional framework.
Yeah, I jokingly told a friend of mine the other day, a liberal, also Catholic. I'm Catholic myself, and I sort of said, the bully that you guys were making Trump out to be. I mean, come on, that's a joke, but that person may be coming. I mean, seriously.
There's like the meme, the Corsican artillery officer is just hiding, waiting for his move or something.
Yeah. And that's my God. I mean, that's such an interesting debate, is like how the culture is. So I say this as someone who has close family members and friends who were raised conservative by conservatives, and now they are very left, and I don't understand it. I think social media and the media play a role where, like, people just believe these narratives that are put out there, which is a shame. I don't know, man. I mean, I wish I had. I try to influence people in my own personal life, and I think I've been able to do that to a degree. But it's a lot more, sadly, than changing the education system. Like said, in many ways, it's too late. Like
it's depressing. It's honestly depressing talking about it. I mean, like I was hanging out with people that were younger than me the other day, friends, family, friends, things like that, and like they're just lost. I mean, it's a lost generation.
And by the way, to a lot of sorry, go ahead.
No, I was just going to say it's depressing. Like I'm talking to people who are, several years younger than me, who are going through the system now. I feel like I just missed it when I went through school. It was never as bad. I think it really accelerated the last 4 or 5 years. But they're totally brainwashed. They don't have a clue. They don't stand a chance in the real world, many of them, and they're setting them up for failure. They're setting them up to become lost souls, because those broken lost soul people are the new masses, this new army that the left's building in their disgusting Antifa movements or whatever it is, BLM. I mean, it's like the worst combination of like left-wing politics and like hedonistic capitalism, just like mashed together, and it's just destroying our society. And I'm worried for the future.
And I think one of the worst things, well, two things. One, there's an element of our side who thinks the answer to appealing to young people is to introduce this climate green bullshit into the so-called conservative movement, or to appeal.
Or how about shooting money from cam girl shooting money from a stage?
yeah, or to be this is by the way a huge myth. Let's be the socially liberal, fiscally conservative party. There's no such thing as a fiscally conservative, socially
like
liberal
a Rockefeller Republican.
Right, and even if they existed, I mean, again,
quadrants. You've seen the dots, that dot map, whatever.
Yeah, they don't exist.
There's nothing in that lower quadrant. It's like there's like one person who probably who was probably just like voting randomly, didn't even know, and it was like a statistical anomaly.
And even if they did exist, I mean, I'm not sure what value. They'd probably bring more harm than value to our movement. And I say this about libertarians all the time. The libertarians for decades have posed as people who are, allies in advancing the conservative cause, but they're really ditching us in all of the key
unless
fights.
They're right-wing, like pro-life Ron Paul libertarians, who I do have respect for, and there actually is a constituency of them within the party, like the Thomas Masseys, the Rand Pauls. Like, I don't agree with them on a lot of things, but they're okay, they're fine.
I'm talking about the Cato Institute people.
Yes, the Wahlberg.
Right, they're perfect to side with the left on big tech overreach, open borders, jailbreak, and then they claim they want to come to our events. They want to influence our candidates and influence who gets on our ticket because whatever, they support a free market. So I think a Rockefeller Republican in that sense would be a similar thing. The other thing I was going to say too is I think the sad thing about all of this is we have to find a way to bring into the culture, whether it's through, for a lot of people, it's religion. For a lot of people, it's values. You talk about the money stripper thing, and it's how do we bring a basic sense of family, sense of responsibility, any of these things. How do we introduce this to the next generation? And for many years, what I've heard from conservative is, scary socialism, scary socialism, scary socialism. Fine. I don't like socialism either. My dad fled a socialist country. But if you want to prevent socialism, stop dismissing the concerns of people who feel like they have to embrace socialism. You should actually offer alternatives. And so a lot of these people who we're just referencing, who are younger and stuff like that, they love Bernie. They embrace these types of things. And I actually think, and Trump has proven, that you can actually win some of these voters if you address some of their economic concerns. The answer cannot be, oh, well, just pick yourself up by the bootstraps, work harder. If you're poor, if the economy isn't working for you, it's your fault. That has been the answer since the 1980s for 1980 Republicans and ever since. And I think if you don't want socialism to happen, instead of ignoring it and dismissing it, that's a way you could pick up some younger generation.
It's not, I'm not a socialist to say there are economic inequities in society. I'm not a socialist to say that there are people that are struggling, not because of their own laziness, not because of their own ineptitude, but because there is a system in place that has abandoned them, that has left them for dead, right, that has gutted their communities, namely globalism, namely, these corporate entities, screwing them over and leaving their towns and their cities and their states to die. You can appeal to that voter, you can appeal to that individual, and you can understand where they're coming from, the struggles that they're facing, and offer some kind of a policy prescription rather than just smugly saying, oh, you're in the position you're in because you're lazy. And then they look and they see a lot of the people are in the positions they are higher up the socioeconomic scale, not because of their own virtue or their own work ethic, just because of who they were born to and whatever it is. So, I mean, it's this kind of arrogance, again, that's just completely dominating large swaths of our movement, if you can even describe it as part of our movement. And it's held us back. And that country club republicanism that people still ascribe to our party, even though we've changed so much over the last 4, 5, 6, 7 years. But it's that same old elitist mentality that people still think that Republicans are the party for this rich, elitist, entitled bunch, and then the Democrats are the party of the working people, when it couldn't be any farther from the truth now, outside of the establishments. But it's hard to shake because it's just been ingrained in the society and the culture.
Well, I'm wondering what you think about, because, that's, I guess, addressing, the young economic left, but the young socially liberal left.
I think they're lost. I honestly think there is like the economics are one thing. That's like a policy discussion. It's like a branding discussion. But I think that's why I'm much more interested in cultural issues and social issues now. And I think they're much more important because it's almost operating like a type of mass psychology.
How do you get them, I guess, is my question.
I honestly think, I think a lot of these people, I'm not going to say a mental illness, but I think No, I mean, maybe, I don't know, maybe some of them are. I mean, some of them definitely are. Don't get me wrong.
To a degree, look, when I was on a college campus, I saw screaming feminist, enraged people who, to talk about a mental illness, you have to look at some of these folks and say,
right. I caveated it, but it's true. I mean, I do think deep down a lot of these people have become mentally unwell because of they've lost any higher value in their lives. They've lost any sort of transcendence, which people found traditionally through religion, but maybe they found it through, just their family structure, starting a business, working for a higher purpose, their nation, their nationalism, whatever it is. They've abandoned all sort of transcendence, and it's only the individual, and there's nothing left, and they're just these empty people who are like just broken toys. They're all broken toys.
Yeah. No, and like,
you can't fix them politically. You're not going to fix them from a political perspective. That's like a whole holistic approach that will take, it may never get done, but you can never just discuss fixing this segment of society that's just so lost and wayward through the political lens.
And talking about the degradation of the culture, I can't for the life of me understand why the Republican Party still insists on shilling, worshiping at the altar of, and giving tax breaks to corporate America, which has probably accelerated the liberalization and the destruction of our culture and our society faster than anybody else. And so at what point, thankfully, many of us have realized, okay, enough's enough. Like, let's not. But, at what point do the rest of the party say, these people are destroying? First of all, if you continue to do this, as we see with big tech, these companies that you're supporting and that you're helping and that you're assisting, they're going to be a part of why you cease to exist in the future. So that's something I certainly don't understand. That frustrates me. And I think I just listening to you talk, I've been trying to think and just some of the things that I've heard recently, I guess, regards to the culture stuff. I don't know what it is. I don't know how people go through our education systems, hating our history, thinking we're a racist country. They hate their own families by the end of it.
That's the scariest. And I saw something today where it was it was literally right before we got on the podcast. It was this woman who was seen at one of the Trump rallies with a bloody nose, and her daughter retweeted as this is my mom. You told me not to go for a BLM rally. but you went to a Trump rally, and then she posts photos of her and her mom, and it's the same
Right.
thing as Kellyanne Conway's daughter. Like
Right.
they, it's like this Maoist thing. Like they've literally been programmed to hate mom and dad, and it's just like it's so creepy to me. It's so creepy that you could literally hate your own blood over politics with such a passion. And you cannot get to that way unless you've gone through like rigorous, intensive, systemic programming uh, over a long period of time, which is exactly what's happening in these colleges. I mean, it's not just the colleges. We can't just say it's the college. It's not just the professors.
It's not
It's
just that. Yeah,
everything.
you can,
It's
yeah.
the media. It's the music. It's everything. And I sound like an old like curmudgeon guy on his stoop, like just yelling at kids as they walk by. But it's like I'm a young guy. You're a young guy. I know it's true. Like I know it's true. And like I've met people and I speak to them and they don't know my politics and I don't let on and I'll just kind of like be coy with them. And I hear them talking about the things they do in their life and how they view life. And it's there. And I'm like, looking, I was like, you are a lost child. Like you have such contempt for your family. You have such contempt for the idea of getting married. You have such contempt for the idea of having children. And you're just like, just glorifying drug culture. You're just glorifying every like excess and vice in society. And you think it's cool. You think it's normal. And you think it's going to be healthy when you're 10 years older, and then you're just like this then you're literally just like a loser, and you have nothing, you've built
Right.
nothing, you've created nothing, and it's almost too late for you. No one likes to say that, but in many cases, by the time they hit a critical mass where they can realize that they've made horrible life decisions based on a lot of BS that they've been spun, it is too late for them in many ways. They're not going to be able to do a lot of the things people were able to do if they started off their life right. Maybe some people will be exceptional and be able to turn it around, but they do wake up and they're 35, they're 38, they're almost 40, and they're basically like at the mental state of a 17-year-old, and
Right.
then they're like, I'm screwed and I've wasted my life, and there's no fixing that. There's no telling them that there's something to work towards anymore. They're done. They're crazy. They've gone off the deep end, and they're exposed to being manipulated by whoever will give them a sense of community or family, whether it's Antifa, whether it's just this left-wing wokeism religion, whatever it is, and they embrace it en masse.
Well, someone in the comments says Nickelodeon, Cartoon Network, Sesame Street. It starts long before college, and that's very true. I think another element here is, aside from what you were saying and these connections that people feel is, and this is something that we're going to have to reckon with. I mean, our side, because it sort of goes against our nature. But I've sort of often wondered, if we had commentators, people in media, TV shows, whatever, who were politically conservative but appeal to the youth. And as an example, like when I was in college, the kids in YAF were nerds. They were policy nerds. The kids in college Republicans were opportunistic, ambitious types.
Sociopaths.
And as much as people want to criticize Turning Point, for the cash stuff, which, is ridiculous and absurd. When I was in college, Turning Point was sort of the more cool social conservative crowd. And what I mean by social is like people who would actually go out to bars and do what 20, 21, 22, 23-year-olds do rather. And so, yeah, there's an element where a lot of what they do, like the strippers shooting the cash cannons, whatever, makes conservatives uncomfortable. And yeah, we should reject elements like that. But I think we have to find a way, not necessarily through them, but we have to find a way to kind of find these cultural figures and icons. As an example, someone who I love and I've always listened to growing up is Howard Stern. He's crude, his show's hilarious. And I've often wondered, like, why don't conservatives have a similar guy like Howard Stern, who just kind of interviews, famous people and has this bullshit but hilarious show. And in part, it's because conservatives would posture and say, how dare you? Like, how dare you have a discussion on sex on your show? And so, again, there's a lot of that element in terms of addressing.
There's a lot of moralizing and self-righteousness on the right. And I think what you're touching on is like people tend to conflate like having more socially conservative views with not being fun. Like I have no problem if you're trying to go out and have a drink, go out, socialize, live a normal, healthy life. I think there's a balance in everything. I think there's this really like very like, I don't want to say evangelical, but there's like this kind of like almost American puritanical element, puritanical conservative element to the conservative movement that you don't that's almost too extreme, and it just repulses most people. And I have nothing against people if they want to live that life, but for example, I've worked with people that were homeschooled and were super evangelical growing up, and like when they got into the real world, and I remember working in an office with this woman, she would write me up every time I would like swear. Like I'd be at my desk and I would see an email, I'd be like, ah, fuck, or something. And I swear a lot, and I swear and I curse, and that's just how I talk. And she was like writing me up. And I'm looking at her, I'm like, what is wrong with you? Like, are you dense? And like, I didn't necessarily agree with her. I agreed with her on a lot of political points and a lot of issues. And she went to, I think, the Liberty or something. And it was just like, there's like this puritanical kind of like zealotry that exists that is just harmful and just way too extreme. I think you can find a balance where people, they'll go to parties, they'll have fun, they'll curse, they'll do things within like the realm of reason for being a young person, but they're still going to want to start a family. They're still going to want to settle down. That's what's important. I don't want them all to be, like as if they're going like, I don't even know how to describe it. I don't want them all to be just total squares and like socially banished people. And I agree with you. I think Turning Point USA has done a lot of good things in this regard. Obviously, I'm going to like poke fun and joke about them when they use strippers to shoot money into a crowd, just because it is a hilarious imagery, and it's just so funny that actually happened. But in the grand scheme of things, they always were a lot better, and they've done a lot of good work in making conservatism cool. And I think we're seeing movements with things like, Barstool, Old Row, like all these things on like the social media networks that, they're like, it's frat partying and all this kind of stuff, but they're still like, at the end of the day, they're like, well, we like America, and like, we do want to settle down.
And we have to endorse that type of stuff. And like a criticism I see all the time from the DC think tank right is like, oh, Turning Point doesn't teach people. And by the way, like I'm not here to defend Turning Point. Like I have criticisms of them too. But like the criticism of them is, oh, well, they don't teach young conservatives anything. They don't educate them on policy. And it's like, so what? Like maybe not every conservative group has to be this wonky organization. Maybe some should exist to bring people together. And to your point, in terms of supporting this type of thing, we don't have to sacrifice our social conservative values to have a more cultural influence. You don't have to support, this transgender stuff to have an influence.
Don't run into ideological ghettos either, like Parler or whatever. I mean, use Parler if you have to, but I think, you should fight to the bitter end to be in the public square and to show people that you're human and you're normal and you're not these freaks that they portray you to be.
Look at a guy like Milo, who they've unfortunately gotten rid of. I thought he did an incredible job of. I mean, he went on college campuses and filled the place.
I had normie friends growing up that were starting to become conservatives because of Milo, and I'm not saying everything he did was great. I mean, I liked a lot of his things. I went to his parties here in the city. I mean, he was a character, and he definitely screwed some people over here and there, and he was all over the place, and he was
I mean, as an example of someone who appealed to
They ruined him purposely. It was a targeted act by these puritanical element who never liked him to begin with, and they never wanted to respect his efficacy, and he did do things that were right, and they just wanted to clutch pearls all the time and offer no real solutions. And it's like you have this guy who's on the net doing such great things for us, but you just hate him as a being and you hate some of his elements. And I don't agree with a lot of people, but I believe in somewhat of a Big Ten. I mean, if he's going to do what he's doing on these campuses and do something to fight back, I mean, give him some kudos. Don't just shut him down. And other people too that they've unpersoned. I mean, Gavin McInnes, I mean, he literally started the hipster movement. I mean, he used to literally be the guy who was interviewing comedians that that we see today on TV. Like he literally gave, he was the person who was helping Amy Schumer rise through her comedy career. That guy they got rid of. They ended him, and he understood the culture. We have no creative capital on our side. We have no creative capital, and all the creative capital drifts to their side because we don't offer any alternative. And then when we get someone who has some creative capital, we squash them because they're threatening our puritanical, sensibilities, and that's why we always end up losing.
Yes, and my plea would be, that's a great point. My plea would be, if you're a rich conservative out there, you have donor money, stop giving your money to the standard DC think tanks. I mean, think about the hundreds of millions of dollars that have pumped there through the years, and then ask yourself about the value that they have gotten. Look, I talked to someone the other day who spoke to what he described a top donor of the Cato Institute, and he was convincing this gentleman to donate to his organization, a newer organization that is sympathetic to what you and I believe in. And he said the donor was shocked to learn that Cato was an organization that was shilling for big tech. So I think a lot of these donors are older, have gotten comfortable to giving their money over the years, and they don't know what's going on. They don't know what these places are supporting. And I think, you want to do something, give money to an up and coming conservative musician or
Yeah.
an actor.
Cultural
We
stuff.
have to we have to help these people succeed. We need the next Howard Stern on radio who happens to be conservative. You know what I mean? Like, we need people who want to talk about music, movies, any of these types of things, even if they're not serious, right? Like, I'm not saying these people have to be the standard bearers of our ideas. Like you mentioned Barstool, you mentioned Old Roll, these people who maybe just exist to have fun and to be funny. Give money to
But
people
having
like that.
fun now is also becoming just a right-wing thing, because the left is just as puritanical, which is
Yes,
interesting.
yeah. I mean, we need that. So we need organizations who can find those people and support those people, because at the end of the day, that's look and actually look at it. Like, as the left has taken over the culture over the last 30, 40, 50 years, our side has still given money to think tanks, and you could argue that look who's winning. I mean,
The
it's
left
more
doesn't even
valuable.
really have the left doesn't even really have a robust think tank network, but they
They don't
have all
need
the
one.
they don't
Yeah.
need one. They have all the political capital world. No white paper has won us an election. No analyst has ever gotten us any real tangible results on the ground that impact your life, my life, whatever. But there was another thing you mentioned too, is like, these college Republican groups and stuff like that, who always kind of just be these just cults of sort of sociopathy, teaching people to backstab each other, teaching people power dynamics, all the worst elements, just all about, political control, but nothing really
It's like, dude, you're in
ideological.
college, like, get a life. Like, if you're
Exactly. I think
backstabbing someone to be secretary of your college Republican clubs, like, you need something better to do.
Yes, I think those are bad, and I think there's another element too, that I think a lot of effort goes into exclusively just the 4 years of college, but there's a big gap after you leave college, where you're like in your 20s and even into your 30s, where you're a young professional, where there's really no institutional framework for you. And the parties used to be supported by these political clubs, which operated like social clubs, networking scenes, places to provide some kind of a community around your politics. And you have nothing after you leave college for the most part. So you go to these major cosmopolitan areas. Maybe you come from a Midwestern town. Maybe you come from a small city in the South, and you have your conservative values. You move to New York, you move to LA, you move to Miami, you move to wherever, and you have no social network that embraces your cultural, political views from where you came from, and you slowly drift away. I'm part of the young Republican clubs. I mean, what we're doing is, I don't want to toot my own horn, but what we're doing in places like New York City, it's like, we have people come from all over the country, and now they have a support network. So they feel like they can stay true to their beliefs that they grew up with. They feel like other people are with them, so they don't have to hide anymore, and they don't have to change their views to have a social life. And that's also very impactful, but it gets no attention, gets no money. But it's something the left does, because the left knows everything about community building and community organizing and creating these sort of social groups that can protect each other and lift each other up. But the right doesn't do that.
Yeah, I've seen you do that, and it should be applauded, because we definitely need more of that. And you go back and mention the think tanks about having an analyst never have won an election or anything like that, and especially more so. Like, I don't know if you've seen what some of these think tanks have put out after the election. I'm not going to name names. I'm still looking for a job, so I don't want to piss anyone off. I'm currently unemployed, but there are some think tanks out there who have, immediately, like after Trump's loss, they were putting out papers saying, like, actually, why regime change is not such a bad thing, or like, the wars in the Middle East. And it's like, if you're going to be a think tank that exists to continue to push policies that not only have been rejected but have proven to be failures
Ineffective
for
failures.
please stop asking me for my money, and go away. So
And stop claiming to be something you're not. Like, again, I respected old school libertarians who understood the distinction between pro market and pro business. And I've gotten into so many arguments online over 230 with Koch funded libertarians who twist their own philosophy to support what is essentially a government granted privilege to one subset of businesses. And I'll literally tell them, it's like, listen, I've read a lot of the same books you have claimed to read about, Austrian economics, free market economics, whatever it is. And I never believed what you believed. I mean, if you had told me when I was still more of a libertarian that there's a policy that only applies to a subset of businesses, that they gain certain privileges, they get certain protections, liability protections, and only those businesses get them. And on top of that, they're not even adhering to the letter of the law, and they're still receiving those privileges. If you had told me that, I would have said, no, that's bad from an economic perspective, a legal perspective, a philosophical perspective. But they don't care. They're just like, well, we get money from big tech, and all I know is we're pro-business and pro-social liberalism, so we're just going to support the business here. And it's like, well, you're an idiot.
And that's
you're
not a so-called free market that they all.
But they're twisting the word, just like how liberalism was twisted originally, and all these terms are coming to mean nothing. I mean, they're waging a semantics war, which does matter because it confuses people. It takes a while. to reverse what the meaning of these words being changed. And people are always subscribing as like, well, I'm this, but now whatever they claim to be means totally something different. I mean, that's a real thing. Orwell talked about it with Newspeak. I mean, war in the language, changing the meaning of things and watering them down, which is kind of what they're doing in a way, it just screws up everything because you can't even have a proper discussion because you don't even know what your point of references mean anymore. But that's another long discussion that I'm sure we can have another day. This has probably been our longest episode so far, but I'm really glad you came on. This was a great discussion, and I definitely want to talk to you again soon. But I'm going to give you the last word, Eduardo. Please let our viewers know where they can find you and where they can reach out to you, etc. And thank you for coming on.
Yeah, Gavin, I appreciate you having me on, and I'm definitely going to have you on my podcast, which I was talking about before we went live. But yeah, I mean, right now I'm on Twitter. I should have put my handle on my title name. It's at edu, my last name Neret, so edu Neret. Instagram, which I don't really use as much, Eduardo.Neret. Neither, I don't really use Facebook. I do have a page there. It's the same as my Twitter handle. But I'm really posting on YouTube. I do have a podcast. I took a break for the holidays, but I'm interviewing people there. We'll be interviewing Gavin here shortly. So yeah, check me out wherever you get your podcast, Spotify, Apple, and I'm most active on Twitter. I mean, that's my political place. I'm posting every day, and yeah, I mean, I appreciate you having me on, Gavin, and I think for anyone who's listening out there, and if you want the Republican Party to be a Republican Party of the views that Gavin shares, that I share, that I'm sure many of his guests share, continue to support all of us, because if not, we're not going to have a say in this game. So.
Thank you. And yes, and if you want to support the Waxcast, please leave us a 5-star review on iTunes. I really appreciate that. And stay tuned for more episodes coming to you very soon. Thank you, Eduardo.
Thanks, man.